Hey guys, tonight, we're stepping back in time to the wild, untamed waters of the 18th century, where shipwrecks weren't just tragic accidents, they were the start of incredible stories. Imagine being stranded on a remote island with nothing but the wreckage of your ship, the ruthless ocean, and a handful of survivors. Your fate, survival. And for some, not just survival, but the rise to kingship over the very seas that once threatened to swallow them whole. It sounds like something out of a high seas adventure novel, doesn't it? But the reality was far stranger and more dangerous. You probably won't survive this. Not without the grit, cunning, and luck of those who became the accidental monarchs of the open waters. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you want to join the conversation, drop your location and local time in the comments. It's always interesting to see where everyone's tuning in from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The 18th century was a time when shipwrecks were tragically common, especially in the vast, unpredictable oceans. Sailors were no strangers to the dangers of the sea. Between brutal storms, navigational errors, and hostile territories, many ships were lost. But for a select few, these disasters didn't mean death. Rather, they signaled a strange new beginning. Picture yourself aboard one of these doomed ships. The waves are crashing, the wind is howling, and the deck is slipping away beneath you. The ship you're on isn't just going down, it's breaking apart, piece by piece. And when it's all over, you're on a strange island. The sea that has claimed your ship now feels like it could claim you too, but you're not done yet. Somehow, you survive. Now, you're faced with an unfamiliar world, dense jungles, bizarre animals, and perhaps even unfriendly locals. No one's coming to rescue you. Your survival depends entirely on your ability to adapt to this new, harsh environment. But that's just the beginning. Historians still argue whether the first survivors of such shipwrecks were destined for greatness or simply found themselves in the right place at the right time. One thing is clear, though, they did something extraordinary. They didn't just rebuild their lives, they built kingdoms, or at least something that could be called a kingdom. The seas, which had once been their doom, now became the backdrop for their rise. It was in these early days of castaway survival that the seeds of future leadership were sown. There was no time for the old ways of European royalty here. On these islands, leadership wasn't about birthright or title. It was about resilience, resourcefulness, and perhaps most importantly, control. Control over resources, over people, and of course, over the sea itself. Now imagine you've survived the wreck and you're alone on an uncharted island with no maps and no idea how long you'll be stranded. You've got to find shelter, food, and water, all while keeping an eye out for dangers, be they wild animals or unfriendly islanders. The sense of isolation is staggering, but it's also where survival instincts are sharpened. For the survivors of these shipwrecks, the first days were all about basic needs. Finding a safe place to sleep, collecting food, and figuring out how to avoid the dangers lurking in the dense jungles. And then came the realization, this new world, though harsh, was full of opportunity. The island wasn't just a place to survive, it was a new frontier full of untapped resources. And like any good adventurer, you start to think, why just survive when you can thrive? Historians have long debated what really happened in those first days after the wrecks. Some think the survivors' resourcefulness led them to create a rudimentary civilization almost overnight. Others believe that necessity brought out the best in these shipwrecked men and women, driving them to develop skills they never knew they had. Either way, one thing is for certain, these survivors weren't just living, they were creating a new society. Let's take a look at one of the most famous examples, Alexander Selkirk. If that name sounds familiar, it's because his story is often thought to be the inspiration for the novel Robinson Crusoe. Stranded on an island off the coast of Chile in 1704, Selkirk spent 4 years alone. But unlike some other castaways, he didn't just sit around waiting for rescue. Instead, he built himself a shelter, hunted wild goats, and used his time to learn survival techniques from the environment. When he was finally rescued, Selkirk had transformed into a leader, someone who had not only survived, but had thrived. Meanwhile, on other islands, shipwreck survivors were figuring out their own survival tactics. They started to gather in groups, establishing their own loose systems of order. One of the first things they realized was that they couldn't make it alone. The survivors needed each other, and soon they began to form small communities based on mutual support and collaboration. These groups had no king or queen to speak of, but they had leaders. These leaders were often chosen for their ability to navigate the challenges of their new environment. Some were natural-born leaders who commanded respect, while others rose to prominence through sheer necessity. Now remember that mysterious, isolated island life. You'd think it would be all about battling nature, but in reality, much of survival was about forming relationships. Whether it was with fellow survivors or the native populations, the shipwrecked crew had to work their way into the social fabric of the island. Some survivors were lucky enough to be accepted by the locals, but others had to barter trade or even fight for their place in the community. But not all survivors were so lucky. While some got along with the islanders, others found themselves in conflict. The survival mentality led to a complicated dynamic. The survivors might have had the technology and skills to build a community, but they didn't always have the diplomacy. The native islanders, on the other hand, had their own established ways of life, which didn't always align with the newcomers' ambitions. Historians still argue whether these early interactions between survivors and islanders were peaceful or whether they were marked by tension and violence. Some say the shipwrecked survivors used diplomacy trading goods like iron tools and European cloth to win favor with the islanders. Others suggest that some survivors in their desperation took a more aggressive stance, trying to dominate rather than cooperate. But regardless of the method, these interactions were pivotal. They helped forge the early alliances that would eventually lead to the emergence of new leaders, men who not only survived the wreck, but became the kings of their new domains. It's not hard to imagine that in such a situation you'd quickly realize the importance of forming alliances. In some cases, these alliances were formalized with shipwreck survivors, even marrying into local families to solidify their power. The ability to adapt, to convince others to follow you, and to use the environment to your advantage became the true mark of a leader. But remember, this wasn't just about forging a kingdom, it was about surviving a world that had no mercy for weakness. With each passing day, these survivors became not only masters of their immediate environments, but of the social dynamics that came with them. And as the weeks turned into months, their influence began to grow subtly at first, and then with increasing momentum. What was once a group of isolated, scared castaways started to resemble something far more organized, a society with its own rules, its own power structures, and its own kings. Now that survival was a bit more secure, the next challenge was leadership. In a world where civilization as they knew it was gone, and nature itself was a constant threat, the survivors couldn't rely on old systems of governance. There was no monarchy to inherit, no empire to rule. Instead, the castaways had to make their own rules, and the process of leadership emerged as one of the most fascinating elements of their new lives. Imagine it. You're among the survivors, and after days or weeks of establishing a precarious hold on life, someone has to step up and take charge. It might not be a pretty sight. There are no crowns, no courts, no formal elections. Instead, leadership is earned often through sheer willpower and the ability to adapt to the challenges of your environment. And just like that, a new order begins to take shape. As these groups settled into their island existence, the need for leadership became obvious. Someone had to manage the daily tasks, who gathers food, who makes shelter, and most crucially, who can make tough decisions when the stakes are high. In some cases, a natural leader arose from the chaos. This could be someone who was particularly resourceful or strategic, or perhaps someone with a military background. These early leaders weren't kings in the traditional sense, but they were something more powerful. They were the ones who kept the survivors alive. Historians often point to figures like William Dampier, a British buccaneer and explorer who was stranded on a remote island in the 17th century. Dampier, despite his rough edges, became something of a leader during his time on the island. His ability to quickly adapt to the island's environment and his knowledge of navigation helped him gain the respect of his fellow survivors. Through the sheer force of his personality, he led them not with royal decrees, but through practical skills and decisiveness. This wasn't the stuff of fairy tales. This was survival. And in the world of survival, leadership wasn't about nobility, it was about necessity. Historians still argue about what makes a true leader in such a scenario. Some suggest that only those who display wisdom and diplomacy should be deemed as leaders, while others point to the more authoritarian figures, those who made decisions quickly without hesitation. Was it the wise decision-makers who kept the peace, or the tough, no-nonsense survivors who maintained control? In the absence of a formal system, these questions remain largely unanswered. Regardless, the ability to wield power, even in the absence of authority, marked the rise of a new kind of ruler. As the survivors began to settle into their new roles, it became clear that their world was fundamentally different from the one they had known. What was once a rigidly structured society with clear lines of authority was now a more fluid and dynamic environment. Leadership became situational. It wasn't about who had the most land or wealth, it was about who could make the right call at the right moment. One of the most interesting aspects of this new form of leadership was how it evolved from necessity. Unlike the kingdoms of Europe, where rulers inherited their thrones through bloodlines, these new leaders came from all walks of life. Some were former sailors or soldiers, others were merchants, and still others were common folk who had survived the wreck. It didn't matter who you were before the shipwreck, it mattered how you adapted in the aftermath. But with leadership comes conflict, and as the survivors' influence grew, so did the tensions among them. Some began to challenge the authority of the island's leaders seeking power for themselves. The question of leadership wasn't just about survival, it became about dominance. Who would control the island and who would hold the ultimate power? These power struggles were not uncommon, and in many ways they mirrored the larger geopolitical struggles of the time. Historians debate how these internal conflicts played out. Some argue that these rivalries led to further breakdowns in the survivors' communities, while others suggest that they were essential in forging stronger leadership. In some cases, these struggles for power were resolved peacefully through negotiation and compromise. In others, they were settled through force, with one group overthrowing another. Regardless of the method, one thing was clear: leadership on these islands was never static. It was always in flux, shaped by the needs, ambitions, and fears of those who held power. In the end, what set these shipwreck survivors apart wasn't just their ability to adapt to the physical environment, it was their ability to adapt to the social environment. In a world where survival depended on cooperation and leadership was defined by pragmatism rather than privilege, these new rulers had to navigate not just the jungles and seas, but the complex webs of loyalty, trust, and power that emerged among the survivors. As they established their dominance, these new leaders would look to secure their power further, often by cementing their authority through alliances with locals or even with other groups of survivors. Leadership, it turned out, wasn't just about managing resources or making decisions. It was about building relationships and weaving a web of influence that could withstand the tests of time. As the castaways found themselves settling into a more structured society, one question began to loom large. How do you hold onto power in such an unstable world? After all, the same sea that had swallowed their ships could also swallow their newfound kingdoms. To truly thrive, these island rulers needed to be more than just survivors. They needed to be innovators capable of using whatever resources they could find to protect their territory and strengthen their position. The first step toward building lasting control was rebuilding. The survivors had few tools and even fewer materials, but they were creative. They scavenged the wreckage of their ships, turning broken planks of wood, torn sails, and abandoned crates into something usable. Whether it was a makeshift shelter or a rudimentary weapon, nothing went to waste. The environment, though harsh, provided the survivors with ample resources if they were resourceful enough to make use of them. Imagine being one of these castaways. You'd probably be exhausted, hungry, and disoriented, but there's no time to waste on despair. You're now part of a group that needs to think quickly and act decisively. If you can find a way to harness the few resources at your disposal, you could quickly gain the trust and loyalty of the other survivors. One of the most fascinating examples of this resourcefulness comes from the survivors of the wreck of the Wager, a British ship that ran aground on a desolate island off the coast of Chile in 1741. In their desperation, the survivors of the Wager used whatever they could find to create tools and weapons for their protection. Some even turned to the local flora and fauna, experimenting with local plants to create rudimentary medicines and food. The shipwrecked crew used their knowledge of European technology, such as iron tools and simple machinery, to fashion new devices that would help them adapt to the island. This was no small feat, as the survivors were literally creating civilization from the ground up. But rebuilding wasn't just about physical structures. It was also about rebuilding social systems. Leaders didn't just need power, they needed legitimacy. In the absence of royal bloodlines and established hierarchies, many survivors turned to practical means of gaining and maintaining authority. They could no longer rely on the laws of European nations, they had to create their own systems of order. Some survivors became the de facto kings of their island realms simply by having the skills to lead and organize. Others, however, relied on brute force or cunning to assert their dominance. Historians still debate whether the most successful leaders of these shipwreck societies were those who ruled with an iron fist or those who gained power through more democratic means. Some argue that authoritarianism was the only way to keep order in such a chaotic world, while others suggest that the most effective leaders were those who practiced a more collaborative form of governance. What's clear is that those who could adapt, whether through force or diplomacy, were the ones who survived the longest. Now, while some castaway rulers used their newfound power to build strong communities, others took a more opportunistic approach. They saw their shipwreck as an opportunity for self-enrichment and took advantage of the situation to extract as much power as possible. These opportunistic rulers often used force to maintain control, holding onto power by threatening or eliminating rivals. In some cases, the island society was little more than a pirate kingdom, with the survivors plundering the resources of any passing ships or nearby islanders. And it wasn't just the survivors who were figuring out how to make the most of their new situation. The surrounding islands and the locals were also adapting. Some islanders, recognizing the potential value of European technology and goods, began to trade with the castaways, exchanging food and raw materials for tools, clothing, and even weapons. This created a unique dynamic between the shipwrecked survivors and the native populations. On the one hand, the survivors were at the mercy of the islanders, who knew the terrain and environment far better than they did. On the other hand, the survivors brought new technology, knowledge, and resources that the islanders had never seen before. This exchange sparked a mutual dependency, creating new alliances and power structures on the islands. Some historians argue that the relationships between the castaways and the native islanders were largely peaceful, based on trade and cooperation. Others, however, point to evidence of violent clashes and power struggles. The tension between the two groups was inevitable. The survivors, for all their survival instincts, were still outsiders. Their presence on the islands, even if initially accepted, likely disrupted the existing social order, leading to conflict. Despite the challenges, the survivors, who managed to navigate these complexities, built kingdoms of their own, often by blending their European knowledge with the indigenous practices of the islands. These rulers might not have had the trappings of European monarchs, but they had something just as important: control. And with control came the ability to shape the future of these islands for better or worse. In the long run, the castaways' ability to utilize their new environment, both in terms of physical resources and social relationships, allowed them to solidify their power. As their influence grew, so did their responsibilities. They were no longer just survivors, they were leaders responsible for their community's survival and prosperity. As the castaways solidified their control over the islands, the next challenge was one of expansion, both in terms of territory and influence. Once they had established a stable footing on their new homes, the survivors started to look beyond their immediate surroundings. The islands, though vast, were limited in resources. In many cases, the survivors knew that to truly build something lasting, they would need to secure additional resources, access to trade routes, and allies. Now, you might think this part of the story would involve intense military campaigns or violent takeovers, but that wasn't always the case. Sometimes the key to expanding a castaway kingdom was diplomacy. As they built their societies, some shipwrecked rulers started to form alliances with neighboring islands or even other groups of castaways. They knew that strength didn't just come from individual power, it came from building relationships with others. And so these once isolated survivors began to look beyond their island borders, forming networks of influence that stretched across the seas. For example, the survivors of the Wagga wreck realized that while their island offered plenty of challenges, it also had something valuable: a strategic location in the Pacific Ocean. By cultivating relationships with neighboring islands, they could ensure a steady supply of food materials and even manpower. These alliances allowed them to form a loose confederation of islands, each with its own leader, but united by trade, mutual protection, and shared goals. It was a far cry from the colonial empires of the time, but it was a kingdom nonetheless. At the same time, some of the more ambitious survivors took a different route. Instead of forging alliances, they turned to piracy. As kingdoms of castaways grew, the lure of plunder became irresistible. These pirate king survivors, who had managed to build their rule through force, saw the ocean as their kingdom. With their makeshift fleets, they began to raid nearby ships looking for treasure supplies and new recruits. The seas, once a barrier to survival, now became the backdrop for their newfound power. Historians are still divided on the role of piracy in the rise of these castaway kingdoms. Some argue that piracy was a necessary evil, a way to protect resources and maintain control in an otherwise lawless environment. Others suggest that it was a sign of desperation, a last-ditch effort to assert dominance in a world that was still largely hostile. Either way, the role of pirates and raiders in these early kingdoms cannot be ignored. They were in many ways the engines of expansion, using the seas as their highway to greater power. But pirates weren't the only ones making waves. The castaways also used trade as a means of gaining influence. As they established relationships with other islands and shipwrecked groups, they began to exchange goods. The survivors, with their access to European tools, weapons and knowledge, had something of great value to offer. In return, they received local goods such as food, raw materials, and even slaves. These trade routes began to shape the economies of these makeshift kingdoms, creating a kind of proto-capitalism that set the stage for larger-scale colonial expansion. The relationship between castaways and native islanders was complex. While some castaways chose to coexist peacefully, others were more predatory. The survivors' access to European technology and weapons gave them a distinct advantage over the local populations. In some cases, this led to exploitation as the castaways traded European goods for precious resources or labor. Historians still argue whether this exploitation was a necessary part of survival or whether it was the beginning of more oppressive practices that would later become common in colonial history. But not all castaway rulers were interested in conquest or exploitation. Some simply sought to establish peaceful, sustainable societies. These survivors valued cooperation and trade over domination and plunder. Their kingdoms were marked by a focus on agriculture, sustainable living, and mutual respect. They sought to integrate with the native populations, learning from them as much as they taught. For them, the goal wasn't to expand their territory through force, but to build long-term relationships that would allow them to thrive together. It's hard to say which approach was the most successful. Some castaway kingdoms grew rapidly through piracy and expansion, becoming powerful maritime nations in their own right. Others remained small but stable, relying on trade and peaceful alliances to build prosperity. In the end, the fate of these kingdoms depended on their ability to adapt, whether through forced diplomacy or a combination of both. At the heart of it all was the same simple truth: the shipwreck survivors, once isolated and vulnerable, had transformed their circumstances. What had begun as a desperate fight for survival had evolved into something much more complex. The castaways were no longer just survivors. They were kings and queens of the sea, rulers of their own islands and leaders of their own people. And though their reigns were often short-lived, their stories lived on, passed down through generations as legends of the sea. As these kingdoms of castaways began to solidify their positions and expand their influence, a new phenomenon emerged: the rise of pirate kings. These were the survivors who not only thrived on their islands, but began to look outward, claiming the sea as their domain. These pirate leaders were often former sailors or soldiers who had learned the ways of the ocean firsthand and saw piracy as the quickest route to power. Picture it. After years of hardship and survival, a shipwreck survivor now in charge of an island realizes that the vast expanse of the ocean offers endless possibilities. With a crew of loyal followers, they venture out, attacking passing ships and raiding coastal settlements. These pirate kings, often with little more than rudimentary ships cobbled together from the wreckage of their old vessels, became forces to be reckoned with on the high seas. In the early days, pirates like these didn't just steal for the sake of stealing. They were building their own kingdoms, sometimes with brutal efficiency. They used their raids to secure resources and recruit new followers, swelling their numbers and their fleets. This allowed them to control trade routes and establish a kind of maritime empire. The pirate kings weren't just pirates, they were rulers, shaping the political and economic landscape of the seas in ways that would influence the world for centuries to come. Historians still debate whether piracy was a symptom of desperation or a calculated move toward empire building. Some argue that piracy was a natural extension of the survivalist mentality that these castaways developed after their shipwrecks. They had already proven their ability to survive and thrive in the most brutal of circumstances. Piracy was merely the next logical step in that evolution. Others, however, see piracy as a dangerous game, a risky venture that often led to the downfall of even the most ambitious leaders. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. Piracy was both an opportunity and a peril, a way to gain power, but also a sure path toward potential destruction. While some pirate kings used their fleets to terrorize their enemies, others sought alliances with nearby colonies or other pirate groups. In this way, they were able to secure their positions and strengthen their control. But even in these alliances, the underlying tension remained. Every pirate captain was at his core a rival for power. Trust was always a tenuous thing, and many pirate kings found themselves betrayed by those they once considered allies. These pirate kings became figures of myth and legend, their stories often exaggerated over time. Tales of daring sea battles, stolen treasures, and legendary escapes filled the imaginations of sailors who shared their stories at taverns and ports around the world. But behind the myths, there was a much darker reality. Life as a pirate king was often brutal and short-lived. These men, despite their dominance on the seas, were always in danger of losing everything. The fickle nature of the ocean and the ever-present threat of rival factions meant that no one was ever truly safe. One of the most famous of these pirate kings was the notorious Edward Teach, better known as Blackbeard. Blackbeard's rise to power was swift, and his reputation was terrifying. With a ship named Queen Anne's Revenge and a crew of ruthless pirates, Blackbeard struck fear into the hearts of sailors along the eastern seaboard of America. His imposing figure, complete with a long black beard and slow-burning fuses tied into his hair, became a symbol of piracy itself. Though his reign was relatively short, lasting only a few years, Blackbeard's legacy lived on. He epitomized the pirate king, a man who, through fear and cunning, carved out his own kingdom on the seas. Despite their fearsome reputations, many of these pirate kings were pragmatic leaders. They needed to maintain the loyalty of their crews, and the key to that loyalty was often simple survival. These pirate kingdoms weren't just about plunder. They were about building a stable, organized society on the water. A pirate captain who could provide food, shelter, and safety for his crew was one who could keep his power. In this sense, the pirate kings of the 18th century were not all that different from the early castaway rulers. They were survivors, but also leaders learning how to create order from chaos. However, this order was fragile. Rival pirates, colonial powers, and even the sea itself posed constant threats to these pirate kingdoms. The pirate kings often had to balance their ambition with the reality of the ever-present dangers around them. Many were eventually hunted down by the British Navy or other colonial forces, their kingdoms crumbling in the face of superior firepower. Yet, even in their downfall, they remained symbols of a particular kind of freedom. Freedom from the rules and constraints of civilization. Freedom to chart their own course in a world where power was determined by the size of your fleet and the strength of your will. The legacy of these pirate kings is a complicated one. Some historians view them as outlaws and criminals, their reigns marked by violence and lawlessness. Others argue that they were simply men who took control of their fate in a world that had cast them aside. Regardless of how we view them, their impact on the history of the seas is undeniable. The pirate kings, much like the castaway rulers before them, left a lasting imprint on the way we think about power, survival, and the allure of the unknown. With the pirate kings dominating the seas, their stories became legends, captivating the imaginations of sailors, traders, and even common folk far from the water's edge. These leaders, once shipwreck survivors, transformed into figures of awe and terror, embodying the wild, untamed nature of the oceans themselves. But as the myth of the pirate king grew, so did the influence of these leaders both on the high seas and in the broader geopolitical landscape. While piracy often conjures images of plunder and chaos, there was an undeniable structure to these pirate kingdoms. Despite the lawlessness that defined piracy, many pirate leaders implemented codes of conduct that governed their crews. These codes weren't about chivalry or romance, they were about survival. The pirate captains had to ensure their crew remained loyal, and in a world where mutiny was a constant threat, a clear set of rules helped keep order. The most famous of these codes was the Pirate Code, which governed pirate behavior and dictated how treasure would be shared, how disputes would be settled, and how discipline would be enforced. The most notorious pirate code was that of Bartholomew Roberts, who led one of the most successful pirate fleets of the 18th century. Roberts' code was strict: pirates were expected to follow orders without question, and any form of insubordination could result in severe punishment. For all the freedom pirates enjoyed, their lives were also tightly controlled by these unwritten laws. Historians still debate the legitimacy and the effectiveness of these pirate codes. Some argue that they were nothing more than propaganda designed to create an illusion of order and respectability among a group of lawless individuals. Others suggest that these codes, though harsh, were an essential part of pirate life, helping to ensure that the crew worked together efficiently and effectively. The reality is likely a mixture of both. While the codes helped maintain order, they were also a tool for the pirate leaders to enforce their authority and prevent rebellion. But pirate kings didn't just rule their crews through codes and discipline, they also ruled through their reputation. A pirate's success was often tied to the fear and respect they commanded. Take Blackbeard, for example. While his violent actions and ruthless nature made him infamous, it was his ability to inspire fear in others that allowed him to maintain control over his crew. Blackbeard didn't just rely on his skill in battle, he knew that creating an image of invincibility was just as important as winning fights. His terrifying appearance, complete with slow-burning fuses in his beard and a reputation for cruelty, made him a figure that other sailors would rather avoid than challenge. This use of reputation as a tool of power wasn't unique to Blackbeard. Many pirate kings cultivated larger-than-life personas using intimidation, charisma, and fear to ensure their dominance. Historians still debate whether this reputation was exaggerated over time, turning the pirate kings into mythical figures far beyond what they truly were. Some argue that the pirate kings' actions were often less heroic than their tales suggest, while others point to their remarkable ability to capture the imagination of the public. Regardless, the legacy of these pirate kings was firmly cemented in both history and popular culture. But as the pirate kings' fame grew, so did their enemies. The rise of these lawless rulers wasn't lost on the colonial powers who saw them as a direct threat to their control over the seas. In the early 18th century, the British Navy, along with other European powers, began actively hunting down pirate fleets. The pirate kings, once the masters of the seas, found themselves increasingly cornered by powerful forces determined to rid the oceans of piracy once and for all. The final days of many of these pirate kings were marked by fierce battles with the British Navy, often ending in bloody confrontations. Blackbeard's own demise came during a violent battle off the coast of North Carolina, where he was killed in a fight with British forces. Despite the British Navy's efforts to stamp out piracy, however, the legacy of these pirate kings endured. They became symbols of freedom, rebellion, and resistance against authority figures who defied the conventions of society and forged their own path. Historians continue to study the pirate kings, fascinated by their rise and fall. Were they simply opportunistic criminals who used violence to claim their share of the world? Or were they rebels challenging the established order and fighting for the freedom of the seas? Some argue that their role in history is far more complex than that of mere criminals. They weren't just lawless outlaws, they were survivors, leaders, and visionaries in a world where the sea was both a source of life and death. They turned the very dangers that had stranded them into tools of power. What is undeniable is that their stories helped shape the history of the seas. The pirate kings didn't just carve out kingdoms on remote islands, they left an indelible mark on maritime culture, inspiring countless stories, songs, and legends. Their legacy persists today in movies, books, and popular culture, where they continue to captivate audiences with their tales of adventure and defiance. But beyond the myths and legends, the pirate kings were also the last great vestiges of the castaway rulers, the survivors who turned disaster into opportunity, who faced the odds and emerged victorious. They were the culmination of a long process that began with shipwrecks and survival and ended with the creation of maritime empires, forged through cunning brutality and an unyielding desire for freedom. As the pirate kings began to fade from the seas, they left behind a world forever changed by their audacity and cunning. But their decline didn't mean the end of their influence. Rather, it signified a transformation in the nature of power on the high seas. The age of the pirate kings may have ended, but the story of castaways turned rulers had far-reaching consequences. In many ways, the power struggles, alliances, and conflicts that had shaped the pirate kingdoms laid the groundwork for the maritime empires that would follow in the 19th century. It's hard to underestimate the role these survivors played in the evolution of naval power. Before the rise of these castaway kings, the seas had been dominated by European colonial powers. The British, French, and Spanish navies ruled the waters, controlling trade routes and building empires. But the pirate kings, for all their lawlessness, posed a direct challenge to this established order. The pirate fleets, though often ragtag and poorly equipped, were flexible and unpredictable traits that made them difficult to combat. They weren't just marauding bands of criminals. They were highly skilled sailors who understood the intricacies of the sea in a way that many colonial navies could not. The pirate king's ability to control vast stretches of ocean for extended periods demonstrated that the seas were not as easily governed as colonial powers had hoped. Historians still debate whether piracy during the 18th century was an inevitable part of the evolving maritime landscape, or if it was a reactionary movement against the consolidation of power by colonial empires. Regardless, it's clear that the pirate king's rise to power signaled a shift in how naval control was perceived and practiced. As the 18th century came to a close, the British Navy began to take a more aggressive stance against piracy. The famous Battle of the Queen Anne's Revenge in 1718, in which Blackbeard was killed, marked a turning point in the war against piracy. But the end of the pirate kings didn't mean the end of maritime anarchy. It only meant that the power vacuum they had filled was slowly being replaced by more formal structures of control. By the early 19th century, maritime empires had begun to grow and consolidate power in a way that the pirate kings never could. The British Empire, for example, expanded its influence over vast parts of the globe, including the Caribbean, Africa, and the Pacific. This period, often referred to as the Age of Sail, saw the rise of global trade networks and the establishment of colonies, both of which were closely tied to naval power. In many ways, the British Navy's dominance of the seas was a direct response to the chaos and unpredictability of piracy. The pirate kings, through their influence and dominance of the waters, had unwittingly created the conditions that allowed colonial powers to strengthen their hold over global trade routes. Yet, the pirate kings didn't just influence the growth of empires, they also shaped the culture of the seas. Their stories were passed down through generations, becoming the stuff of legend. The myth of the pirate, whether true or exaggerated, persisted long after their reigns were over. Pirate ships became symbols of freedom and rebellion in a world where colonial powers sought to control every inch of land and sea. But while the pirate kings left an indelible mark on maritime history, they also left behind a legacy of instability. Their kingdoms, built on stolen treasure and force, lacked the foundation of stable governance. As a result, many of these pirate kingdoms fell into disarray. Without a clear structure of power, the survivors, who had once ruled over their own islands, found themselves caught in a cycle of violence and betrayal. Rival pirate factions, seeking to control the wealth and resources of the seas, often clashed, leading to the eventual collapse of their empires. The downfall of these pirate kingdoms was inevitable. As the British Navy and other colonial powers strengthened their fleets, the pirate kings found it increasingly difficult to maintain their hold on the high seas. Yet despite their fall, the pirate kings' legacy endured. Their stories were woven into the fabric of maritime culture, inspiring countless generations of sailors, adventurers, and even revolutionaries. Historians still debate the extent of the pirate kings' influence on global history. Some argue that their reigns were nothing more than a brief and violent chapter in the history of piracy, while others contend that their actions set the stage for the rise of global empires. What is undeniable, however, is that the castaway rulers who rose from the wreckage of their ships left behind a lasting legacy that continues to captivate the imagination. In the end, these pirate kings were more than just criminals. They were survivors, innovators, and leaders who defied the odds. They transformed the very landscape of the seas, creating a world where power was determined not by birthright or nobility, but by the strength of will, the ability to adapt, and the capacity to forge alliances. Their kingdoms, though short-lived, were the precursors to the maritime empires that would dominate the world in the centuries to come. As the pirate kings faded into history, their legacy didn't just linger in the form of tales and legends, it also influenced the world of colonial expansion and the global economy. The rise and fall of these maritime rulers were not just confined to the pages of adventure novels. They had a tangible impact on the geopolitical landscape. As colonial powers strengthened their grip on the seas, the once chaotic waters began to settle into more predictable trade routes and established navies, but not without echoes of the past. At its core, the story of the pirate kings was the story of power in flux. In the 18th century, power on the high seas wasn't something that could be easily controlled or contained by any single nation. Pirate kings, through their opportunistic raids and flexible strategies, had proven that maritime dominance was more complex than simply owning a fleet of ships. The oceans were vast and treacherous, and those who controlled them had to be equally adaptable. For the colonial powers, this was both a threat and a challenge. They would need to be as cunning and resourceful as the pirate kings if they were to secure their control over the global trade networks. The influence of these pirate kingdoms can still be seen in the way the colonial empires navigated their global ambitions. In many ways, the pirate kings acted as a sort of test case for the larger imperial endeavors that followed. Colonial powers, particularly the British, understood that if they were going to control the vast oceans and the lucrative trade routes that crisscrossed them, they had to be far more strategic than ever before. Pirates had shown that brute force alone wasn't enough. To truly master the seas, a combination of naval might, political savvy, and the ability to form temporary alliances was essential. This new approach to imperialism was particularly evident in the British Empire's efforts to solidify its control over the Caribbean, the Americas, and the Indian Ocean. In these regions, pirate activity had been rampant for decades as shipwreck survivors and opportunistic sailors carved out their own realms. The British Navy, learning from the pirate kings' tactics, began to use similar strategies, ruthless force combined with calculated diplomacy. British officials would often offer pirate leaders the chance to retire in exchange for allegiance, effectively bringing them under the Crown's control. This process, known as privateering, was a legal form of piracy where pirates were granted the authority to raid enemy ships on behalf of the British Crown. The line between pirate and imperial agent became increasingly blurred, making it clear that the legacy of the pirate kings was woven deeply into the fabric of empire building. Historians still debate the ethical implications of privateering. Some argue that it was an extension of the pirate kings' influence, allowing them to operate within the boundaries of the law, while others suggest that it was a necessary evil, a way for colonial powers to ensure dominance without directly engaging in constant warfare. Either way, the system of privateering represented the ongoing interplay between piracy and empire. It was a reminder that despite their fall, the pirate kings had fundamentally altered the way empires interacted with the seas. But it wasn't just the pirates themselves who left a mark on the world. The shipwreck survivors, in their struggle to rebuild, had introduced new technologies, practices, and knowledge to the islands they had inhabited. While many of the pirate kings used their newly acquired resources to strengthen their hold on power, others shared their knowledge with local populations, sparking cultural exchanges that would continue for generations. The introduction of European tools. Weaponry and agricultural techniques transformed the way islanders lived, allowing them to build their own fledgling societies based on European models. It was a complex and sometimes contentious relationship, but one that ultimately reshaped the way these communities interacted with the world around them. One of the most notable examples of this cultural fusion came in the Pacific Islands, where survivors and pirates alike had interacted with indigenous populations. In many cases, the survivors traded European goods and knowledge for local resources, effectively creating a hybrid system of governance and economy. This exchange was not without its challenges, as native populations often found themselves caught between the old ways of life and the new influences brought by the castaways. Yet, this hybridization laid the groundwork for the colonial projects that would later be established across the Pacific and the Caribbean. Historians argue about the extent to which these exchanges were mutually beneficial. Some suggest that the survivors' influence on the native populations was primarily exploitative, as the European settlers sought to extract resources and wealth from the islands. Others believe that these interactions were more symbiotic, with both sides benefiting from the exchange of goods, knowledge, and cultural practices. What is clear, however, is that the pirate kings played a role in shaping the global landscape, not only through their actions on the high seas, but also in the way they interacted with the native populations they encountered. This cultural and economic exchange, while often fraught with tension, was part of the larger process of global interconnectedness. The piracy of the 18th century, fueled by shipwreck survivors, was one of the driving forces behind the establishment of global trade networks. The pirate kings, with their makeshift kingdoms, had helped pave the way for the colonial empires that would dominate the seas for centuries. Their legacy was one of both disruption and transformation, a reminder of the fluid nature of power and the ever-changing dynamics of the world's oceans. In the end, the pirate kings were more than just outlaws. They were pioneers. Their ability to adapt to the challenges of the sea, to forge alliances, and to navigate the complex social and political landscapes they encountered allowed them to create empires of their own. And though their reigns were short-lived, their influence can still be felt in the way we think about the relationship between power survival and the open waters. Their story is one of resilience, audacity, and defiance, one that continues to inspire those who seek to conquer the unknown. As the pirate kings and their turbulent reigns gradually faded from the high seas, their influence continued to resonate in ways that weren't always immediately obvious. While they no longer controlled vast stretches of ocean, the legacy of their leadership, survival, and strategic thinking continued to shape the way empires interacted with the seas. Even as colonial powers established more formal dominions over trade routes and maritime territories, the stories and lessons learned from the pirate kings remained ingrained in the culture of the sea. One of the most enduring impacts of the pirate kings was their contribution to the development of maritime law. The pirate codes, those sets of rules that governed pirate behavior and interactions, were among the earliest examples of an attempt to impose order on the chaotic world of the ocean. Though often considered a rough, even barbaric system, these codes were revolutionary in their own right. They sought to create a framework for cooperation and accountability in a world where might often made right, and they set the stage for the establishment of more formal maritime regulations in the centuries to come. The influence of these early pirate laws can be seen in the evolution of privateering during the 17th and 18th centuries. As piracy became more formalized, colonial powers such as Britain and France saw the advantage of utilizing pirates to do their bidding. Privateers, who were essentially legalized pirates, were given letters of marque, allowing them to raid enemy ships on behalf of their respective countries. This practice blurred the lines between piracy and legitimate naval operations, and it was directly influenced by the pirate kings' ability to establish their own codes of conduct on the seas. In fact, privateers, who were often former pirates themselves, took the lessons learned from their pirate predecessors and used them to build entire naval campaigns. By the time privateering became an officially recognized part of naval warfare, it had been shaped by decades of pirate kings operating outside the law. The pirate kings, through their improvisational tactics, demonstrated that even in the absence of formal support or resources, one could wage war on the seas with great success. Another key influence of the pirate kings was their role in the evolution of global trade. As pirates, these figures didn't just target foreign vessels, they disrupted the entire flow of goods across the seas. By hijacking merchant ships, they forced global powers to rethink the way they conducted commerce. While the colonial empires initially viewed pirates as little more than a nuisance, they soon realized that the pirate kings were a serious threat to the profitability of their global networks. This realization led to innovations in trade security, with navies and merchant fleets implementing better defenses against piracy. Ironically, the pirate kings' success in disrupting global commerce led to stronger protections for trade, which ultimately allowed European empires to secure their dominance in world markets. Despite their often violent and chaotic methods, the pirate kings were in many ways the unwitting architects of a more secure and regulated global trade system. By forcing the European colonial powers to adapt their tactics and strategies in response to piracy, the pirate kings contributed to the shift from lawless raiding to more organized, state-controlled maritime activities. In essence, these figures, who were once seen as outlaws and rebels, helped pave the way for the global capitalist system that would define much of the 19th and 20th centuries. The pirate kings' influence also extended to the realm of cultural exchange. Their raids and interactions with local populations led to a blending of European and indigenous practices. Many pirate crews, especially those operating in the Caribbean and the Pacific, consisted of men from diverse backgrounds, including African slaves, indigenous people, and Europeans. These diverse groups brought their own cultures, traditions, and knowledge to the pirate kingdoms, resulting in a unique fusion of European, African, and indigenous cultures that influenced local societies for generations. This cultural fusion wasn't always peaceful or harmonious, but it created a lasting impact on the regions where the pirate kings operated. For example, in the Caribbean, the interactions between pirates and indigenous groups led to a blending of European and Native American languages, traditions, and social structures. Similarly, in parts of West Africa and the Indian Ocean, pirate activity introduced new technologies, agricultural techniques, and even religious practices, leaving a lasting mark on local cultures. Historians still debate the extent to which these cultural exchanges were mutually beneficial or exploitative. Some suggest that the pirate kings and their crews imposed European values and systems on indigenous populations, while others argue that these interactions were more collaborative, with both sides exchanging knowledge and resources. Regardless of the nature of these exchanges, it's clear that the pirate kings were a part of a larger global movement of cultural fusion that would continue to shape the world for centuries. In the end, the pirate kings of the 18th century were more than just outlaws and rebels. They were agents of change, influencing not only the course of maritime history, but also the development of global trade culture and politics. Their rule on the high seas, though short-lived, was a precursor to the more formalized systems of colonial and imperial control that would dominate the world in the centuries that followed. Historians continue to study the pirate kings, fascinated by their rise, reign, and eventual downfall. Were they simply ruthless criminals, or were they the last great representatives of a disappearing way of life? Were they leaders of a new order, or were they simply opportunistic survivors of a world in flux? The answers to these questions remain elusive, but one thing is certain. The pirate kings left an indelible mark on history, and their legacy continues to captivate our imaginations to this day. As the pirate kings receded from the historical spotlight, their stories continued to cast a long shadow over maritime law, fueling our fascination with the high seas. Yet while their tales of treasure betrayal and rebellion live on in books and movies, the real-world consequences of their rise and fall went much deeper. The pirate kings didn't just shape the culture of piracy, they had a lasting impact on the way the colonial powers and emerging global empires viewed the very nature of naval warfare, territorial conquest, and the global economy. The transformation from the pirate kings to more formalized colonial control marked a critical turning point in maritime history. While the pirate kings had established their rule through force, luck, and cunning, colonial empires sought to control the seas through a much more structured approach. As European navies grew in strength, they began to systematically eliminate piracy, not only by hunting down individual pirates, but by shaping the very conditions that allowed piracy to thrive in the first place. The global trade routes that had once been the domain of lawless raiders were now governed by imperial powers, and the seas became increasingly dominated by naval fleets acting under the orders of kings and queens. But this wasn't just about the elimination of pirates, it was also about the consolidation of power. With the disappearance of the pirate kings, the colonial powers gained unprecedented control over the seas, and in many cases, this control was absolute. Nations like Britain, Spain, and France expanded their naval fleets, turning them into the backbone of their empires. The piracy that had once been a constant threat became a thing of the past, replaced by official naval forces tasked with defending trade routes, enforcing colonial borders, and keeping foreign powers at bay. This shift from piracy to imperial naval control didn't happen overnight. The collapse of the pirate kingdoms created a power vacuum, and the colonial powers didn't waste any time stepping in to fill it. The British Navy in particular emerged as one of the most dominant maritime forces in the world, using its vast fleet to maintain control over key trade routes and colonies. With the pirate kings out of the picture, the British were able to secure their hold over the Caribbean, the Americas, and much of Africa, positioning themselves as the primary naval power of the 19th century. But while the pirate kings may have been defeated, their influence wasn't completely erased. The methods and tactics employed by these survivors of shipwrecks and pirates were still relevant to the colonial powers. The British Navy, for example, had learned valuable lessons from the pirate era. Their ability to adapt to changing circumstances, the use of surprise tactics, and the flexibility of their fleets all reflected the lessons learned from the pirate kings who had once ruled the seas. In some ways, the imperial navies of the 19th century were a more refined version of the pirate fleets, continuing to use the same strategies that had made the pirate kings so formidable, but with greater organization and resources. The pirate kings also left a lasting legacy in the way they influenced the economies of the regions they ruled. Although their reigns were short-lived, the wealth they accumulated through piracy left an indelible mark on local economies. The influx of treasure from plundered ships combined with the trade relationships established between pirates and local populations injected a new source of capital into the islands they controlled. This helped create a new vibrant and often volatile economy that revolved around the trade of goods, slaves, and resources. But as the colonial powers took over, they began to formalize these economies, replacing the loose, decentralized trading networks of the pirates with structured, imperial-controlled systems. In many cases, the wealth generated by piracy was siphoned off by the colonial powers, leaving the local populations in the same position they had been before the arrival of the pirate kings. While some pirate rulers had shared their wealth and resources with local populations, others had simply used their newfound power to exploit them. The shift from piracy to empire didn't just change the way power was distributed on the seas, it also fundamentally altered the economic systems that governed the regions these pirate kings had once ruled. Still, the memories of these pirate kings lived on. In the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, and in the Pacific tales of pirate treasure, hidden islands, and secret alliances continued to be passed down through generations. The pirate kings, for all their brutality and lawlessness, had captured the imaginations of the people they ruled, and their stories would never be fully erased. These tales became woven into the fabric of local cultures, inspiring songs, legends, and folklore that would continue for centuries. The rise and fall of the pirate kings is in many ways a reflection of the age-old struggle for power and control. Whether through brute force, clever diplomacy, or sheer survival instinct, these men and women rose from the wreckage of their ships to carve out their own kingdoms on the seas. And though their reigns were often short and violent, their legacy is still felt today. The pirate kings were the last great rebels of the high seas, challenging the traditional power structures of their time and reshaping the world in ways that we are still trying to understand. In the end, the story of the pirate kings is a story of transformation. From the castaways who began as mere survivors to the rulers who commanded vast maritime empires, the pirate kings represented a new kind of power, one that emerged from the ashes of shipwrecks and the wreckage of old systems. They were not just pirates, but pioneers who forged new paths on the open seas, leaving behind a legacy of adventure, rebellion, and the undying allure of the ocean. The death of the pirate kings didn't spell the end of the stories that surrounded them. In fact, the final chapters of their reigns were some of the most dramatic moments of the 18th century. As the British Navy and other colonial powers moved in to rid the seas of pirates, the once feared pirate kingdoms collapsed under the weight of imperial power. But even in their defeat, these pirate kings left behind a legacy that would resonate for centuries to come. As these pirate kings were hunted down, captured, or killed in battle, they became martyrs of a kind. Their violent ends, often in bloody sea battles or through public executions, only served to add to their mystique. These deaths, brutal as they were, sealed their place in history as the last great symbols of rebellion against established order. The tales of their deaths, their final stand against the imperial forces, were woven into the larger-than-life myths that had grown up around them. But the deaths of these pirate kings were not the end of their story. Instead, they marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that would see their lives transformed into legends retold by generations of sailors, adventurers, and dreamers who longed for the freedom of the sea. The stories of their rule, their daring exploits, and their last moments became part of the cultural fabric of the places they once ruled. From the Caribbean to the Indian Ocean, the pirate kings were remembered not as criminals, but as rebellious heroes who defied the powerful forces of empire. Historians still debate the true nature of the pirate kings' legacy. Were they simply outlaws who lived outside the law, or were they the last great independent rulers who sought to challenge the emerging colonial powers? The truth, like the pirate kings themselves, is a mix of both. They were criminals, but they were also rulers. They were rebels, but they were also survivors. And in their own way, they reshaped the world of the seas. For many, the pirate kings represent a time when the sea was still wild, when it was still a place of possibility and adventure. They were the last of the old guard, the last of the seafaring adventurers who fought for survival and control in an unforgiving world. Their rise and fall marked the end of an era in maritime history, an era when the sea was ruled by those who dared to defy the law and take their destiny into their own hands. But despite their fall, the influence of these pirate kings would continue to shape maritime culture for centuries to come. Their stories, often exaggerated and romanticized over time, would inspire countless generations of sailors, pirates, and adventurers. Their legacy lived on in the songs and legends that filled taverns and ports across the world, where their names were spoken with awe and respect. The pirate kings in their final moments had become icons, symbols of the freedom and rebellion that the sea represented. These stories didn't just live in the imaginations of the people who told them, they shaped the very identity of the places the pirate kings had once ruled. In the Caribbean, in the Indian Ocean, and along the coasts of Africa and the Americas, the memory of the pirate kings lingered long after their death. The pirate flags that had once flown high on their ships were replaced by the Union Jacks and French tricolors of the colonial powers. But the spirit of the pirate kings remained inspiring the cultures that had once been their domains. Their influence didn't just stop at the shores they once ruled. The pirate kings' legacy lived on in the way modern naval forces operate. The agility and unpredictability of the pirate fleets, combined with their brutal tactics and flexible strategies, helped shape the way that navies around the world thought about naval warfare. The lessons learned from the pirate kings' approach to naval battles raids and control over the seas influenced naval tactics well into the 19th and 20th centuries. Some historians suggest that the pirate kings, by disrupting the established order, helped pave the way for the modern era of naval warfare. They were the pioneers of hit-and-run tactics, small fast ships, and surprise attacks techniques that would later become the hallmark of modern naval combat. Though they didn't have the firepower or resources of the colonial navies, they were far more mobile, and that made them dangerous. Their success on the high seas demonstrated that speed, adaptability, and clever tactics could often overcome superior numbers and firepower. As the centuries passed, the pirate kings and their reigns on the high seas slowly faded into the realm of legend. But their impact on maritime history was undeniable. They had created kingdoms out of shipwrecks, carved out empires from the ocean, and defied the most powerful navies in the world. The end of the pirate kings marked the beginning of a new era, but the lessons they taught about resilient survival and the power of the sea continued to echo through history. Their downfall did not signify their complete disappearance. Instead, it allowed them to live on as icons of freedom and rebellion. In modern times, the pirate kings are remembered not just as criminals, but as symbols of resistance and defiance in a world that sought to control the oceans and everything within them. Their stories, far from being forgotten, became timeless, immortalized in novels, films, and folklore. So, as we look back on the pirate kings, we can see them not just as remnants of a bygone age, but as figures who changed the course of history. Their rise to power, their incredible feats of survival, and their eventual demise at the hands of colonial forces left an indelible mark on the world of the sea. The pirate kings were the last great rebels, the last to hold dominion over the ocean before the tides of empire swallowed them whole. Their story, however, is far from over. It continues to inspire, to fascinate, and to captivate us long after the pirate flags were lowered. As we continue to delve into the lives and legacies of the pirate kings, it becomes clear that their influence extended far beyond the oceans they once ruled. The pirate kings, for all their lawlessness, were also the pioneers of a new world, one that straddled the boundary between chaos and order, between anarchy and empire. Their kingdoms were temporary, fragile, and often short-lived, but they were also crucial in shaping the trajectory of maritime history and colonial expansion. What made the pirate kings so compelling was not just their ability to command the seas, but their very existence as outliers, figures who lived outside the structures of law and tradition. They weren't part of the established world of monarchy, nobility, or empire. Instead, they carved out their own domains, relying on survival instincts, ruthless strategies, and often the manipulation of existing power structures. In this way, they were the ultimate rebels, challenging the very idea that the seas should be governed by any one authority. Historians still debate whether the rise of piracy was an inevitable response to the colonial empire's expansion. Some argue that piracy was a reaction to the overreach of European powers, whose ships and colonies dominated vast stretches of the world. Pirates in this view were not just criminals, but freedom fighters pushing back against the imposition of foreign rule on the seas. Others suggest that piracy was born of economic necessity, that pirates were simply people who had no other means of survival in a world dominated by trade monopolies and rigid colonial structures. Regardless of the causes, the pirate kings represented a shift in how people viewed the seas. They were no longer simply a place of exploration and conquest for empire building. The seas had become for a brief moment in history a place of freedom, a realm where the rules were made by those who could navigate its treacherous waters and seize control from those who thought they ruled it. In this sense, the pirate kings embodied the spirit of the age. They were the embodiment of the Enlightenment's challenge to established authority, the desire to break free from the constraints of tradition and forge new paths. They were also a direct challenge to the authoritarian colonial powers that sought to impose their will on the oceans. The pirate kings, for all their brutality and lawlessness, were an assertion of individual agency in a world that often sought to suppress it. The eventual downfall of these pirate kingdoms, however, signified the triumph of the colonial powers. As the British and other European navies strengthened their fleets and began to coordinate their efforts, they systematically eliminated piracy as a viable force on the seas. With the introduction of more effective naval technologies, the rise of privateering and the consolidation of empire, the pirate kings found themselves outmatched. Their once feared fleets were no match for the organized power of the state. Yet even as the pirate kings were driven from the seas, their legacy lived on. The idea of the pirate king, of the individual who could defy authority and create their own kingdom, remained a powerful symbol. It became a symbol not just of rebellion, but of the quest for freedom and autonomy in a world that was increasingly dominated by empires. The Pirate King's stories inspired future generations to challenge the status quo, to question the boundaries set by colonial powers, and to dream of a world where the seas could once again be ruled by those brave enough to claim them. The influence of the Pirate Kings was also felt in the realm of maritime law. Though pirates were eventually hunted down and their kingdoms dissolved, the concept of privateering, of individuals acting with the sanction of a state, continued to shape naval warfare and maritime politics for years to come. In some ways, the Pirate Kings were the precursors to the modern naval conflicts that would define the 19th and 20th centuries. Their tactics, born of necessity and survival, would be refined and institutionalized as the great powers of Europe sought to dominate the oceans in the age of imperialism. In the years following their downfall, the Pirate Kings' legacy was immortalized in popular culture. Stories of their exploits, their treasure, and their larger-than-life personalities became the stuff of legend. These stories were retold in books, songs, and plays, and their images were romanticized in the public imagination. The Pirate Kings, once feared and reviled, were transformed into symbols of freedom, adventure, and resistance. They became the heroes of the common man, the champions of those who dared to live outside the confines of society's rules. As the centuries passed, the Pirate Kings became larger-than-life figures celebrated in modern films and novels. Their images, often distorted or exaggerated, became symbols of rebellion against authority. They were portrayed as fearless adventurers willing to risk everything for freedom and treasure. But even as their tales were embellished, the core of their story remained the same: the story of survival, the story of defiance, and the story of men and women who carved out their own kingdoms on the vast, unpredictable oceans. Today, when we think of the Pirate Kings, we remember them not just for their crimes, but for their resilience. They were survivors, dreamers, and rebels. They were people who, despite overwhelming odds, took control of their fate and created kingdoms where none had existed before. And in the end, it was not their downfall that defined them. It was the indelible mark they left on history, the way they changed the way we think about power survival and the freedom of the sea. As we reach the final stages of the Pirate King's story, it's impossible to ignore the profound impact their reigns had on the legacy of maritime law, the global economy, and the very concept of freedom on the seas. The Pirate King's kingdoms, though short-lived, served as both a symbol of resistance to authority and a demonstration of the power of the sea itself. Their stories resonated with the idea that the vast expanse of the ocean could not be tamed not by empires, nor by governments, nor even by the powerful navies that patrolled its waters. The pirate kings were in their own unique way the last great embodiment of an era when the ocean seemed to promise boundless freedom and when one's destiny could be forged entirely by their own hands. Despite their inevitable demise, the tales of these pirate kings became entwined with the romanticized vision of the sea as a place where anything could happen, a place of adventure, danger, and possibility. For generations, sailors and explorers would look to the pirate kings as exemplars of the spirit of the sea. Their cunning, their ability to survive, and their ruthless ambitions became the stuff of legend even as the world around them changed. The legacy of piracy, once a disruptive force, evolved into something far more symbolic. It represented freedom from the constraints of society, a desire to chart one's own course, and the ever-present allure of the unknown. In the centuries that followed their decline, the pirate kings inspired writers, filmmakers, and storytellers. The classic figure of the pirate captain, bold, daring, and unyielding, became a staple of literature and cinema. Movies like Pirates of the Caribbean revived the myth of the pirate king for a modern audience, though this version was often more playful and fantastical than the harsh realities these rulers faced. Yet, beneath the humor and the swashbuckling adventures, the pirate kings of old remained an inspiration. Symbols of rebellion against authority, embodiments of individualism, and proof that the sea could still offer the promise of freedom. Interestingly, the fall of the pirate kings also marked the beginning of a new kind of empire. The imperial powers that emerged in the 19th century built their control over the seas with a combination of military might, trade, and colonization. Yet, the specter of piracy still haunted them. It was as if the ghosts of the pirate kings were forever lingering on the horizon, reminding those in power that the seas were not their domain to rule forever. Piracy may have been crushed by powerful navies, but the spirit of the pirate king lived on, influencing the way future generations approached the sea. While the pirate kings themselves are long gone, their legacy shaped the way we understand power and rebellion in maritime culture today. Even now, there are those who romanticize the idea of piracy, seeing it not as a crime, but as a form of resistance. The idea that one could take control of their own destiny unbound by the rules of governments or corporations remains appealing. And so the stories of the pirate kings endure as timeless myths. Stories of men and women who chose to live life on their own terms and dared to challenge the status quo. What's perhaps most fascinating about the pirate kings' legacy is how it transcended their time. Though their kingdoms were built on piracy and violence, they also represented something much larger: the desire for independence. The pirate kings were not merely criminals. They were individuals who seized control of their own lives when all seemed lost. They were pioneers in a world where the seas were the final frontier, and they knew that to survive, they had to bend the world to their will. Their kingdoms, though fleeting, provided the space for creativity, resilience, and a certain rugged individualism that would resonate with future generations. These pirate kings showed that even in the face of overwhelming odds, one could carve out a place of their own. And in doing so, they created a mythology that would be passed down for centuries, a mythology that continues to inspire those who look to the horizon and dream of freedom and adventure. The world that the pirate kings left behind was not one of polished empires or grand palaces. It was a world built on ship survival and the raw, untamed power of the sea. The pirate kings weren't just kings of their islands or their ships, they were kings of a world that was still wild and uncharted. And in the end, it was that very wilderness that gave them their power. The seas, once a source of peril and uncertainty, had become the stage for their greatest adventures and ultimately their greatest downfall. But even in their fall, the pirate kings achieved something remarkable. They reminded us that freedom, power, and survival are often not granted, they are seized. And they did so with the very thing that had once threatened to destroy them, the sea itself. The Pirate King's story, as tragic as it may seem, is also one of triumph. It's the story of how a group of desperate shipwreck survivors became the last great rulers of the open ocean, carving out their own destinies no matter the cost. As we reach the final chapter in the story of the Pirate Kings, it's important to recognize that their legacies endure not just in the history books, but in the way we continue to perceive the sea. Though the Pirate Kings may have been chased from the oceans, their influence remains alive in the way we tell stories about freedom, rebellion, and the call of the open water. Their kingdoms may have been short-lived, but they set the stage for the broader history of maritime adventure, pushing the boundaries of what was possible on the seas. When we look back at their reigns, it's not just their survival skills that stand out, but the way they embodied the untamable spirit of the ocean itself. They were survivors, yes, but they were also innovators willing to embrace the chaotic and unpredictable nature of their environment. This was the essence of their power. Nothing about their rise to dominance was guaranteed. They weren't born into power, and they didn't inherit it from anyone. They had to carve it out of the rough waters of the world, and they did so with incredible resourcefulness. The Pirate King's story is one of human perseverance against the odds. From shipwrecked sailors stranded on deserted islands to rulers of their own kingdoms, their transformation was nothing short of remarkable. In a world where empires were built on the backs of massive fleets and complex systems, these rogue leaders had to start from scratch using nothing but their wits and the resources they could find. Their ascent didn't follow the usual patterns of political power. It was messy, unpredictable, and often brutal. But in that chaos, they found a kind of power that traditional rulers could never replicate. And yet, despite their skill in creating kingdoms on the seas, the Pirate Kings were not meant to last. Their reigns, built on unstable foundations, were doomed to fall once the imperial powers turned their sights on them. The British Navy, with its superior resources and organized forces, eventually crushed the pirate kingdoms, forcing them to retreat into myth. The colonial powers would go on to dominate the seas, carving up the world into colonies, empires, and trade routes. But the spirit of the Pirate Kings lived on in the stories that they left behind, in the way they challenged the traditional notions of power, and in the ideals they embodied. In many ways, the fall of the Pirate Kings marks the end of an era, a time when the seas were still untamed and full of possibilities, where individual ambition could create its own empire, however temporary. The rise of the British Empire and other colonial powers sealed the fate of piracy as a significant force on the seas. But the echoes of the Pirate King's rule continued to influence maritime history, even as the world moved into a new age of imperial expansion. What's fascinating about the Pirate Kings, though, is how they've been remembered. Despite their fall, their names have lived on, immortalized in folklore fiction and popular culture. Whether it's through the romanticized tales of pirate ships and buried treasure, or the more gritty and realistic portrayals of life on the pirate-infested seas, the legend of the Pirate Kings continues to captivate our imaginations. These figures, once feared as enemies of the empire, have become symbols of freedom, adventure, and rebellion. The Pirate Kings, in their own way, helped redefine the world's relationship with the sea. They took what was once a realm of brutal power struggles and turned it into a stage for personal autonomy and defiance. Their reigns, though brief, were marked by a kind of freedom that we continue to idolize today. They proved that even in the face of overwhelming odds, it was still possible to carve out a place for oneself and challenge the established powers. Their victories, though often fleeting, served as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is always room for resistance. As time passed, the story of the Pirate Kings began to take on a life of its own, transforming from historical fact into myth. Their kingdoms, though never stable enough to last, became the stuff of legend tales of treasure, adventure, and rebellion passed down through the generations. The Pirate King became a symbol of independence, a figure who stood against the tide of empire and sought to claim the seas as his own. Their stories weren't just about wealth or power, they were about living life on one's own terms, defying the odds, and embracing the wild, untamed spirit of the ocean. And even now, the stories of these pirate kings continue to inspire. Whether it's in the form of swashbuckling adventures, modern-day piracy, or the enduring image of the pirate captain who defies all authority, their influence lives on. The pirate kings may have lost their hold on the seas, but they never lost their place in the world's collective imagination. They remain the last great rebels of the ocean, the ultimate symbols of freedom, resilience, and defiance in a world that often seeks to constrain and control. As we close the final chapter of their story, it's clear that the pirate kings were not just outlaws, they were pioneers, revolutionaries, and dreamers. Their kingdoms may have been born of shipwrecks and chaos, but they represented something much larger, the enduring human desire for freedom, adventure, and the pursuit of one's own destiny. In the end, the pirate kings left behind a legacy that transcended their time, one that continues to captivate and inspire, reminding us that the seas, though ruled by empire, will always belong to those who dare to dream. Sweet dreams. Sweet dreams, 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 sweet